14. Connor Chapman. Locals were innocently celebrating Christmas Eve at a pub in Wirral, England in 2022 when someone opened fire on the crowd using a submachine gun. The onslaught of bullets fatally struck a 26-year-old beautician named Elle Edwards, who was outside smoking a cigarette with some friends. At least 4 others were injured. Investigators determined that she wasn't the intended target. 2 of the men standing near were the intended targets of the shooting. The parties involved were entangled in an ongoing feud between local criminal gangs. It was an annual tradition for locals to gather at the pub on Christmas Eve. In all the years that Elle and her family and friends had been going there, no major violence had ever occurred. Authorities charged several suspects in connection with the deadly crime, but pointed toward 22-year-old Connor Chapman as the actual shooter. According to prosecutors, Chapman waited outside the pub for hours for the intended victims to step out. Phone records, DNA, and other evidence put him at the scene of the crime. A jury convicted Chapman of murder, attempted murder, and possession of a firearm and ammunition with the intent to endanger life. He was sentenced to life with a minimum of 48 years. 13. Tiffany Moore. Felicia Hester was just 19 years old when she was gunned down outside a nightclub in Elizabeth, New Jersey in 2011. Police found the young woman lying on the sidewalk with a bullet wound to the chest at around 2 o'clock in the morning. She was rushed to the hospital in grave condition and died 2 days later. Several days after the shooting, authorities charged 21-year-old Tiffany Moore with first-degree murder and 2 gun-related counts. At the time, she was already being held in custody on unrelated charges. According to court documents, Moore was a confirmed member of the Peru Gang Alliance, which is a subset of the Bloods gang. The circumstances of the shooting and whether it was gang-related are unclear. Moore took a plea deal and admitted to manslaughter in exchange for a 22-year sentence. She'll be eligible for release after serving 85% of the sentence, or 18.7 years. 12. Graham Potter. An Australian gangster named Graham Potter became the country's most wanted man in 2010 when he skipped bail on 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. He was accused of being hired to kill 2 men and was also wanted for his alleged involvement in trafficking $440 million worth of ecstasy. Potter has a mile-long rap sheet dating back to 1976, including a murder conviction he served prison time for during the 1980s. It wasn't exactly surprising that he didn't show up for court, but investigators probably didn't expect years to go by without being able to capture him. 6 months after he went on the run, Potter left behind a series of bizarre notes at a campsite in the remote town of Tully in Australia's far north. The messages detailed how he used various disguises to avoid being recognized in public, including fatsuits, wigs, and hair dye. He also found places to stay by befriending lonely elderly women. By the time law enforcement discovered the campsite, Potter had fled. The following year, he was pulled over for a routine traffic stop, but managed to speed away without being captured. It was the closest authorities would get to him for more than a decade, as they tried painstakingly to track him down. But information trickled in at best, despite a $100,000 award being offered for tips leading to Potter's capture. In 2022, police received a tip that the fugitive was hiding out at an abandoned house in the far northern town of Ravenshoe. Officers and K9 stormed the crummy shack early in the morning and found Potter lying in bed. The fleeing felon initially tried claiming that the officers had the wrong man, but it quickly became clear that he was going to be arrested whether he liked it or not. The house was filthy and hoarded with junk and garbage, and Potter was disheveled. The 64-year-old looked like a man on the run, suggesting that it was getting difficult for him to survive as a fugitive. Potter remains in custody as the investigation into his alleged crimes continues. Authorities are also trying to piece together a timeline of his 12 years on the run. The court's currently in the process of determining whether there's enough evidence to go to trial, and the next hearing on the matter is in December of 2023. At the very least, Potter will languish in custody for a long time as the case drags its heels in court. 11. Killing for status. In December 2016, 28-year-old Crispin Colas got into an argument with 2 young men at a convenience store on Chicago's northwest side. He decided to move on from it and left the store in his vehicle. But the men he argued with didn't seem ready to let it go. According to authorities, they followed Collis in an SUV before pulling up next to him and shooting him in the head. The suspects remained at large for several months, during which time the shootings continued. 3 young men were killed, and at least 3 were injured in the unprovoked attacks, which occurred between 2015 and 2017. In a 2019 federal indictment, investigators identified the suspects as 26-year-old Hector Rojas, 25-year-old Jose Martinez, 21-year-old Santo Lozoya, and 22-year-old Pedro Navarro. According to prosecutors, the men were members of the Milwaukee King Street Gang. Santo Lozoya and Pedro Navarro were accused of being responsible for the murder of Golpes. To mark the occasion, they each got a tattoo beneath their eye depicting the logo of a bottle of liquor they bought that evening. Federal authorities charged the suspects with murder in aid of racketeering, and Navarro faced 2 additional counts of attempted murder in aid of racketeering. The men were accused of committing the violent acts in a bid to elevate their status within the gang. And they may have gotten some street cred, but they also got lengthy prison sentences. As the group's alleged mastermind, Navarro received the lengthiest term of 33 years. At some point in life, many people go through a phase where fitting in is one of their top priorities, and most of us grow out of it, but some don't. 10. Yochino Gamino. Modern technology is making it increasingly difficult for wanted criminals to hide from the law. New advances are even helping to lead to the capture of fugitives who've been on the run for decades. One such individual, an Italian mobster named Yochino Gamino, was captured in early 2022 after evading law enforcement for 20 years. Gamino was part of the Sicilian mob, also known as La Cosa Nostra. He escaped from a prison in Rome in 2002 while awaiting trial for murder, drug trafficking, and organized crime. If convicted of the murder charge, he faced a potential life sentence. According to investigators, Gamino most likely walked right out of the prison while a movie was being filmed there, taking advantage of the chaotic situation and slipping out unnoticed. Authorities were quick to add him to Italy's list of most dangerous fugitives. They hoped someone would come forward with information leading to his whereabouts, but it took almost 2 decades for a useful lead to emerge. Gamino was convicted of murder in absentia, and in 2014, Interpol issued a warrant for his arrest. In 2022, a tipster claimed that Gamino might be living in the Spanish town of Galapagos outside Madrid. The detective decided to look around the town using Google Maps Street View to see if he could spot a vegetable stand Gamino was rumored to own called El Huerto de Manu. He not only found the store, but saw the fleeing mobster himself standing right in front of the business. Further investigation revealed that Gamino previously owned a restaurant where he worked as a chef. The business had closed, but its TripAdvisor page still existed, and it featured a photo that showed Gamino working in the kitchen. The 60-year-old was shocked when law enforcement abruptly arrested him. He asked them how on earth they'd tracked him down, noting that he hadn't called his family in over a decade and had lived under various aliases. His main mistake was his failure to account for today's rapidly advancing technology, which assisted police while they also employed more traditional methods of investigating the case. After 20 years of living a new life as a different person, Gamino was returned to Italy to finish out his life sentence. 9. Matthew Dupree and Jean Larkamp. Thailand is notorious for its heavy-handed justice system and hellish prison conditions. And while this may discourage some foreigners from committing serious crimes, others are undeterred. Canadian national and alleged gangster Matthew Dupree allegedly falls into the latter category. Thai authorities are accusing the 38-year-old military veteran and another Canadian citizen, 36-year-old Jean Carlyle Larkamp, of traveling to the country to murder a criminal gang member in early 2022. The victim, Jimmy Slice Sandhu, was born in India and raised in Abbotsford, British Columbia. He was deported back to India in 2016 due to his serious criminality. 2 years later, he was arrested for participating in a ketamine manufacturing operation. On February 5, 2022, Sandhu was shot dead roughly outside of his beachside villa on the island of Phuket, roughly 435 miles south of Bangkok. By the time investigators identified Dupree and Larkamp as the hooded men who killed Sandhu, the pair had returned to Canada. Authorities managed to track down and arrest Dupree, who remained in custody while the two countries negotiated his extradition. Larkamp died in a mysterious plane crash 2 months after Sandhu's murder while running from the law. At the time, he was one of Canada's most wanted men, with a $100,000 reward being offered for his capture. He was flying as a passenger on a small aircraft with another fugitive from British Columbia named Duncan Bailey, along with 2 pilots who had no criminal records. The plane crashed near Sioux Lookout, Ontario during the early morning hours of April 30, 2022, killing everyone on board. According to investigators, Larkamp told his military friends that he was going to Thailand for an overseas job shortly before Sandhu's murder. He said that the gig was for a private military company but said little else about it. His law-abiding circle was reportedly shocked when they learned that Larkamp was a fugitive and an accused international hitman. Dupree was extradited to Thailand in May of 2023 after Thai officials agreed not to pursue the death penalty. He could have appealed the decision but didn't want to slow the case down. According to an online fundraiser seeking donations for Dupree's legal expenses, he's being held at a maximum security jail in Bangkok with a disturbing reputation while he awaits trial. Jean Larkamp's friends struggled to believe that a man they'd come to know as kind-hearted and peaceful was accused of committing a brutal murder. What's the most surprising, unexpected truth you ever learned about someone? Let us know in the comments below. 8. Huang On. In 2018, an unlikely suspect appeared on the Interpol's most wanted list in the form of an unassuming woman in her 60s named Huang On. The Vietnamese national is accused of heading a major international drug trafficking syndicate. Operating primarily out of the region where Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar meet, known as the Golden Triangle, On's organization allegedly imported hundreds of kilograms of heroin, methamphetamine, and ecstasy into Vietnam. Organized crime runs in On's family. Her sister, Dung Ha, was Vietnam's second highest-ranking crime boss during the 1990s. She was murdered by her rival Nam Cam, also known as the Godfather of Saigon. The two had once worked together to operate illegal gambling rings, but they became bitter enemies when their business relations soured. Interpol issued its wanted notice for On during the first large-scale bust of her drug ring. Police seized dozens of kilos of meth, more than 100,000 ecstasy pills, and a large amount of heroin. 7 people were arrested, but by the time law enforcement moved in on the gang, On had fled the country and was believed to be hiding out in Cambodia. She eluded authorities for 4 years while carrying on her illicit business, which included a trafficking route that transported drugs over the land border between Cambodia and Vietnam. According to Vietnamese officials, the traffickers hid the drugs inside the engine blocks of cars and drove the product to warehouses in various cities, including Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi. Acting on newly acquired intel in 2022, a task force of more than 100 police officers and military members took down the organization. Over 131 kilos of drugs were seized and 29 people were arrested, including On. The case appears to be ongoing. 7. Alan Moradian. Nicknamed Sydney's Tony Soprano, Alan Moradian was one of the country's most powerful cocaine lords. He was also known for his extravagant taste and opulent lifestyle, which included a lavish mansion, first-class travel, luxury cars, and a mouth full of gold teeth. In fact, Moradian was allegedly such a show-off that he was scolded for it by his wife Natasha Yucana, who once told him in an email to be more low-key like Tony Soprano. She also accused her husband of wanting attention and signed off the note with an ominous warning, "People like that won't survive." Moradian was part of a secret cartel called The Commission, which has a powerful foothold in Sydney's drug trade, and he had connections with the Comancheros biker gang. In 2011, he pleaded guilty to his role in a cocaine trafficking operation and admitted to importing more than 40 kilos of the drug, although prosecutors insisted the amount was much higher. He was sentenced to up to 16 years in prison and was paroled in 2017. After his release, Moradian took his wife's advice and kept a lower profile. And while he managed to avoid any further legal trouble, his problems with rival gangsters reached their worst point following his release. Moradian went into hiding completely in 2022 after learning that there was a contract out on his life and that hitmen were actively searching for him. The news came directly from law enforcement officials who urged Moradian to move immediately and change his routine. Moradian sold his mansion, lived separately from his wife to protect her, moved from place to place to stay one step ahead of his enemies, and stayed off social media completely. The despised drug boss managed to evade the hitmen for 10 months. His life on the run came to an end in June of 2023, when he was fatally shot in the underground parking garage of an apartment building. He was sitting in a rented car when he was executed at point-blank range, taking so many bullets to the head that he was barely recognizable afterward. Killers are still at large. Following her husband's death, Natasha Yochino told the Daily Mail that she faulted Australian authorities for not allowing Moradian to leave the country or even the state. To her, it didn't seem like an unreasonable request, considering the threat to Moradian's life and the fact that it managed to keep his nose out of trouble since his release from prison. He also had less than a year of parole left, but he remained confined to the region while other big-time organized criminals fled and fell victim to rising violence between gangs. Yochino said that she believed Moradian would still be alive if he'd been allowed to relocate to somewhere far away. There was heavy security at the fallen gangster's funeral, which authorities had cautioned reporters against attending due to the risk of violence. The police presence was also heavy, with multiple patrol cars driving laps around the church, plainclothes officers in attendance at the service, and a unit of undercover officers stationed nearby. Since then, Sydney's remained plagued by gang-related shootings. Authorities are insisting that they haven't lost their control over the streets, but people are beginning to question these claims that the violence continues with no end in sight. Some people might agree that Moradian should have been allowed to flee Australia in order to save his life, while others would argue that he created his own problems by being a career criminal. 6. James Jim Carlyle. 42-year-old Irish career gangster James Jim Carlyle had over 170 criminal convictions under his belt by the time he was accused of trying to kill his romantic partner in 2023 by dousing her with lighter fluid and lighting her on fire. He was arrested for the crime while he was out on bail and awaiting sentencing for an attack on another woman over an alleged drug debt. The victim of the previous attack, Olivia Creaney, told the Sunday World that she'd never met Carlyle before the night he assaulted her in 2021. It all started when thugs showed up at her door looking for her cousin. The cousin wasn't there, and the gangsters threatened to burn Creaney's house down and harm her family if she went to the police. Creaney was left with multiple facial fractures, a broken nose, internal head bleeding, and was blinded in one eye. Carlyle had a long history of victims dropping charges because they were afraid for their safety. But sooner or later, he was bound to cross paths with someone who refused to back down to him. Olivia Creaney was that person. Wanting to set an example to her children about not tolerating abuse, Creaney stood by her case against Carlyle, and he ultimately pleaded guilty to grievous bodily harm, assault, intimidation, and possession of a knife. After the more recent attack on his partner, Carlyle was held on an attempted murder charge at Margaberry Prison, Northern Ireland's only maximum security correctional facility. 2 weeks later, he was found dead in his prison cell. Authorities have ruled out foul play. Carlyle's criminal history dates at least as far back as 2001, when he was accused of murdering a teenager named Peter McNally. And for decades, he managed to weasel out from underneath serious criminal charges. In the McNally case, he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and continued his life of crime. Over the years, Carlyle became a henchman for Malcolm McCown, a notorious crime boss who was murdered in 2019. In 2012, Carlyle and McCown were accused of murdering suspected drug-dealing couple Hugh and Jacqueline McGough. The case was dropped in early 2013, despite Carlyle allegedly being linked to the crime through DNA. And while the judge said it may not be the end of the matter, neither he nor McCown were ever prosecuted for the double murder. Karma came knocking in 2016, when Carlyle was shot 4 times by a rival gang member. He survived after taking 2 bullets to the chest and 2 to the arm. Despite the fact that he may have gotten away with murder and was lucky enough to escape death at least once, Carlyle's lifestyle amounted to little more than a legacy of violence with a sad ending. It serves as a sobering reminder of how being a gangster usually isn't as glamorous as people often think. 5. Sarah Polinsky. A British woman named Sarah Polinsky was on trial for her alleged role as the leader of a fraud gang when she went on the run in 2013. The court proceedings continued during her absence, and she was sentenced to 8 years in prison. According to authorities, Polinsky illegally resold cell phones from abroad and laundered the profits through companies in Andorra and Dubai. 17 other defendants were convicted and sentenced to prison time for their roles in the operation. Polinsky is the only one who went on the run. In 2015, police tracked her down outside Barcelona in the Spanish town of Olivella. But Polinsky somehow got word that law enforcement was on her trail, and she changed her appearance and fled before they could arrest her. After realizing that investigators may have located her through her family ties in the region, she distanced herself from her relatives. The search continued for years with no luck until early 2022, when police received a tip that Polinsky might be living in the town of Santa Barbara. After conducting weeks of surveillance, detectives felt confident that they'd found the fleeing fugitive living on the outskirts of town. They arrested Polinsky while she was outside walking her dogs and extradited her back to the UK to serve her sentence. In a statement, National Crime Agency spokesman Tom Dowdall speculated that Polinsky might have thought enough time had passed for authorities to stop searching for her. He cautioned the public to think of the case as a reminder of how British law enforcement will not rest until a fugitive is captured, no matter how long it takes. 4. Edgardo Greco. Many people don't realize that there's more than one Italian mob. The one most commonly spoken of is the Sicily-based La Cosa Nostra, but there are multiple other powerful gangs with very similar mafia-like structures. One of them is the 'Ndrangheta, which has had a global presence since the 1950s. It's one of the world's most powerful criminal organizations. Founded in Calabria, the group's crimes center mainly around drug trafficking, but the organization also dabbles in gun trafficking, money laundering, racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, prostitution, and other crimes. 'Ndrangheta member Edgardo Greco vanished in 2006 while facing trial for a double murder he was accused of committing 15 years earlier during a violent mafia war in the Calabria region. Greco allegedly beat brothers Stefano and Giuseppe Bartolomeo to death outside a fish market and dissolved their bodies in acid. A court convicted him of the crime in absentia and sentenced him to life in prison. Greco remained untraceable for years as investigators searched for even the slightest trace of him. In many cases, authorities locate fugitives through their communications with their families. But he didn't contact anyone in his family, including his wife and 2 sons. At some point during his time on the run, Greco relocated to the French city of Saint-Étienne, where he lived under the alias Paolo Demetrio. Law enforcement finally began to make progress in their search for Greco in 2019, when they began tracing his support network. Their suspicions that he was living in France were confirmed when they came across a newspaper article from 2021 featuring Greco as the owner of a new pizza restaurant. Despite his use of an alias and the fact that he hadn't been seen in 16 years, the investigators recognized him in a photo that was featured with the article. Like most organized criminals who were captured after years hiding from the law, Greco's capture was rather uneventful, probably because he wasn't expecting it and was caught with his guard completely down. Once he was taken into custody, authorities began the process to extradite him to Italy, where he'll resume his prison sentence. 3. The Felony Lane Gang. In 2010, a theft and identity fraud ring called the Felony Lane Gang originated in Florida. It operates mainly by having its female members steal purses from women while the men commit smash and grab robberies. Members use these stolen IDs and credit cards to write bad checks, go on shopping sprees, and commit other crimes. The gang's name was inspired by the tendency for its female thieves to wear wigs and use bank drive-through lanes that are furthest from the window so they're difficult to see. According to the FBI, the Felony Lane Gang has a big online presence. Law enforcement's fine with this because it makes their job of identifying and catching criminal suspects much easier than it would be otherwise. As of 2020, the Washington, D.C.-based Felony Lane Gang Task Force had arrested around 1,500 members across the United States. A large portion of the investigative work is carried out using Facebook, where suspects tend to throw caution to the wind when it comes to their publicly posted content. Instagram is also a popular platform among FLG members. In 2019, 3 women were arrested in Indiana for thefts that were committed in Georgia after posting photos on the network, along with captions daring federal investigators to do their job. And in some cases, informants have pointed authorities in the direction of FLG members who were using social media under nicknames. A 40-year-old Detroit woman named Christina Smith was busted after posing for Facebook photos in the same sunglasses she allegedly wore while fraudulently cashing checks at banks. She was apprehended alongside another FLG suspect named Jamar Dukes, who was also identified through the use of social media. Smith reportedly collected $150 for every $1,000 check she successfully cashed. While the FLG may have a tendency to overshare online, every gang has its strengths. This one specializes in high-speed chases, mainly because its members know that in many places, police won't pursue a subject at high speed unless they're confident that the person is an imminent threat to public safety. Factions of the gang also tend to travel, going on interstate crime sprees rather than staying in any given place for too long. As of 2023, the FLG remains in operation amid law enforcement's continued efforts to dismantle the organization. Some of the most recent news reports have warned the public that the gang has reappeared in Syracuse, New York, and southern New Jersey after a hiatus from the areas. The FLG is especially prevalent along the East Coast and along I-75, which runs from Florida to the very top of Michigan along the Canadian border. It doesn't seem like the group's going to be shut down anytime soon, and authorities are warning civilians to keep a close eye on their belongings to avoid becoming the next victim. 2. Modern-day grave robbers seek revenge. George Moradian immigrated from Iraq to Australia at a young age with his family. He grew up outside Melbourne, where he fell in with the wrong crowd and became a career criminal by the age of 16. Since then, he's spent no more than a year at a time outside of jail. In 2019, Moradian founded a crime syndicate called the Notorious Crime Family. The gang abided by a code of 19 commandments, including a strict ban on using certain drugs and a willingness to support other members in all circumstances, right or wrong. As the organization's leader, Moradian headed major drug and fraud operations. Today, he's in a maximum security prison for murdering a rival drug dealer in 2016, and he's not getting out anytime soon. In addition to receiving a 32-year sentence for the murder, Moradian was sentenced to 16 years for continuing to run his drug operation from behind bars. Since being convicted of his crimes in 2020, he spent nearly 24 hours a day in isolation. In 2021, the Kingpin's younger sister, Michelle Moradian, died from COVID-19 complications. She was just 30 years old. Michelle is credited with playing a key role in her brother's rise to the upper echelons of the criminal underworld. While George was unable to attend the funeral because he was in prison, Michelle was given the type of lavish burial one might expect a gangster's family member to be laid to rest in. Members of a rival organization took gang warfare to a new low in 2023 when they broke into the mausoleum where Michelle was buried in the middle of the night. In what appears to be a body-snatching mission gone wrong, they dragged Michelle's coffin out of place and smashed it open, but left her body there after discovering that the elevator to the ground floor was out of order. The botched grave robbery came during an uptick in violence between Australia's Middle Eastern gangs. And while gang rivalries can get ugly, desecrating the grave of an enemy's loved one is not a normal occurrence, even for a man like George who's probably created more enemies than he can probably count. It's been widely seen as an ultimate show of disrespect, and authorities are reportedly worried that the violence between gangs will escalate. No arrests have been made in the case, and the investigation is ongoing. And now for number 1, But if you want to hear even more stories, stay tuned for some extra content that you might have missed. 1. Rafaela Downstario. It's uncommon for women to become members of the Italian mafia, let alone rise to a position of leadership. But as the daughter of a mob boss, you could say that it was in Rafaela Downstario's blood. In addition to being born into organized crime, she married into it. So, it was only natural for her to step in and take the reins after her husband Nicola Pianez was fatally gunned down in 2006. Many believe that Downstario killed her husband in a bid to end an ongoing mob war. Nicknamed A Micchiona, or the Big Female Kitten, Downstario was in charge of highly profitable drug cartels that operated out of Naples under a cell of the Camorra mob. In 2009, mobsters targeted her in a shooting out of jealousy over her power and wealth. She survived and continued to run her organization's illicit businesses. The shooting came at a time when the local mob, the Camorra, was at war with the notorious Sicilian mafia, La Cosa Nostra. While the Sicilian mob is the better known of the two parties, the Camorra has a long-standing reputation for being more ruthless and violent. Over a 30-year period from 1982 to 2012, the Camorra allegedly killed more than 4,000 people. Downstario's criminal career came to an end in 2012 when she was busted for extortion, robbery, drug dealing, and possession of illegal weapons. She and several of her associates were accused of squashing competition with rivals through the use of violence and intimidation. Prosecutors claim that Downstario also sought to expand her cell's power by strengthening her ties with other Camorra leaders. At the time of Downstario's arrest, mob-related shootings were a daily occurrence in and around Naples. Altogether, 65 people went down in the bust as part of a ramped-up effort to curb the gang violence in the streets. Rafaela and several of her associates were reportedly sentenced to hard time and have remained largely out of the spotlight ever since. 17. David Chiselton. Public defender Aaron Brockler faced an uphill battle for negotiating any kind of leniency for David Chiselton. His client was accused of assaulting his girlfriend and burning down an apartment building in Cuyahoga County, Ohio in 2019. By then, Chiselton had a mile-long rap sheet that included violent past offenses, and he now faced a multitude of charges including felonious assault and multiple counts of aggravated arson. Brockler and the prosecution reached an agreement that would require Chiselton to plead guilty to several charges in exchange for a sentence of 9 to 100 years. If Chiselton took the deal, it would be up to the judge to decide the sentence. It certainly was no guarantee that he would receive the 9-year minimum. In fact, that was highly unlikely, but it was the best Brockler could do for his client. Chiselton took the deal and hoped for a 9-year sentence. When the judge sentenced him to 47 years, he became infuriated. Blaming his defense attorney for the sentence, Chiselton sucker-punched Brockler in the face while in handcuffs, knocking him unconscious. Court officers immediately tackled Chiselton and handcuffed him, this time behind his back rather than in front. Meanwhile, Brockler regained consciousness. He had a broken nose and a concussion. Authorities charged Chiselton with felonious assault, but a jury acquitted him of the charge after his attorney successfully argued that Brockler's injuries weren't serious enough to qualify for a conviction under the charge. Chiselton clapped gleefully after the verdict was read and let out a satisfied hoot as he was being led out of the courtroom. Speaking with the ID channel series Chaos in Court, Brockler said that he and Chiselton had a good relationship up until that point, and that he did everything he possibly could to negotiate the best possible outcome for his client. He was disappointed about the acquittal because he felt it sends the message that people can assault their attorney and get away with it. 16. Alan McCarty Jr. During a family court hearing in Volusia County, Florida in 2017, 36-year-old Alan McCarty Jr. was denied custody of his children. During this particular hearing, he was accused of threatening his kids and violating a restraining order. His lengthy criminal history, which spanned at least 3 states and included priors for domestic violence, kidnapping, indecent exposure, and other charges, may have also had something to do with the judge's decision. McCarty became furious with the judge, Stacia Warren. After the hearing, he dialed 911 and said that he wanted to report a crime that was about to happen. He instructed the dispatcher to bring Judge Warren into the parking lot so he could execute her, and he also threatened the dispatcher. After hanging up, McCarty called 3 more dispatchers and continued making threats against Warren. He was charged with threatening a public official and was facing up to 40 years in prison if convicted. For the next year, he languished in jail with no bond while awaiting trial. His trial began in 2018 in front of Judge Matt Foxman. McCarty refused to cooperate with his public defender or wear a suit and tie, so he was brought into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. When the courtroom was ordered to rise at the beginning of the hearing, McCarty remained seated and gave the judge the middle finger, yelling that he wasn't under oath. He then launched into a verbal tirade about how the court was unfair to him for taking his kids away from him, and he threatened Judge Foxman. The judge asked McCarty, "Do you want to be here or not?" He replied that he didn't want to be there and that he was being unconstitutionally prosecuted. McCarty accused the court of violating his rights and basically acted like an armchair legal expert who thought that everyone else was the problem and that his behavior had nothing to do with the situation he was in. Foxman remained calm while court officers surrounded McCarty just in case something was about to happen. The defendant was ultimately removed from the courtroom and put behind a two-way mirror, where he was out of sight but could still hear and respond to everything that was going on. He continued to yell and cuss, but the case eventually proceeded. The jury deliberated for just 30 minutes before finding McCarty guilty, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. 15. Keith Swainson. After receiving criminal mischief complaints one Saturday night in 2016, Houston police responded to the home of 49-year-old Keith Swainson. A 7-hour standoff ensued as officers tried making contact with the suspect. At one point, Swainson opened fire on responding officers through the windows of his house. A police sergeant shot back and was struck by debris from Swainson's gun. After failing to get him to cooperate, a SWAT team deployed tear gas into his home, at which point he finally surrendered. During his initial court hearing 2 days later, Swainson began shouting and swearing at the judge. Someone nearby yelled at Swainson not to talk like that, which only seemed to exacerbate his out-of-control behavior. Disturbing footage of the outburst showed the suspect being led out of the courtroom by multiple law enforcement officials, with what appeared to be dried blood all over the side of his face. When questioned about Swainson's injuries, defense attorney David Parrish II told the press that his client had a right to seek medical care, or not. He further explained that the jail had medical staff who were capable of treating Swainson, and speculated that the defendant hadn't got a chance to seek treatment yet, given the eventful nature of the last few days. The outcome of Swainson's case is unclear, but prison records show that nobody by his name is currently in custody in Texas. 14. Kimberly Kessler. When 34-year-old mother of 3 and hairstylist Jolene Cummings disappeared from her workplace in 2018, suspicion fell on her co-worker, Jennifer Seibert. She denied doing anything to harm Cummings, but the evidence quickly stacked up against her. While investigators couldn't find the victim's body, they found evidence of a large amount of blood that had been cleaned up inside the hair salon where the women worked, and surveillance footage showed Kessler throwing out heavy garbage bags outside the building long after her shift ended. She had also gone to Walmart earlier that evening and bought cleaning supplies and an electric knife before returning to the workplace. After finding Jolene's missing SUV and surveillance footage connecting Seibert to where it was left, the police had enough evidence to at least arrest Seibert for stealing the missing woman's car. They picked her up at a rest stop where she was living in her vehicle and questioned her further about Jolene's disappearance while booking her for the vehicle theft charge. In addition to behaving in an overly animated way, Seibert admitted that she'd been living under aliases for 20 years and that her real name was Kimberly Kessler. She was eventually indicted on a first-degree murder charge. Over the next year, the court wrestled with the issue of Kessler's mental state and her competency to stand trial. She'd gone on a hunger strike in jail, losing over 100 pounds, and her behavior had become increasingly erratic over time. Corrections officers described having cups of urine thrown at them, being threatened and harassed by Kessler, and finding feces smeared on the walls of her jail cell. Kessler was ruled incompetent to stand trial and sent to a mental hospital for 6 months in an effort to restore her competency so the case could resume. Another year went by and she was transferred back to jail. Her weight continued to drop and her behavior remained out of control. At one point, the sheriff asked the court for permission to force feed her, but she began eating again. After 2 more mental evaluations, the judge ruled Kessler competent to stand trial. By then, the prosecutors had begun to speculate that she was exaggerating her condition in hopes of being found not guilty by reason of insanity. When she refused to attend her pre-trial hearings, Kessler was strapped to a chair and wheeled in. She screamed and shouted during almost every single court appearance, accusing her former defense attorney of being related to Jolene Cummings. The claim was found to be untrue. On most occasions, Kessler was removed from the courtroom so the hearing could proceed. Her displays may have prolonged the cause, but she was eventually forced to face justice. The jury convicted her of Jolene's murder and sentenced her to life without parole. 13. Jacob Lawson. Judge John McBain is known for his no-nonsense approach to criminal cases. So, when accused stalker Jacob Lawson showed disrespect in the courtroom one day in 2016, things got ugly fast. The victim told the judge that Lawson had violated a protective order that Judge McBain had issued on a previous occasion. She said Lawson was continuing to contact her despite the order banning communication between the two. To make matters even more disturbing, the woman reminded the judge that she and Lawson didn't even know each other, but that he'd pursued her relentlessly after she made it clear she had no interest in him. When McBain asked Lawson why he violated the order, he claimed that the victim instigated it by posting attractive photos on social media. The victim told the judge that she had no connections with him on Facebook, Twitter, or any other platform. Frustrated with Lawson's apparent lack of cooperation with the protective order, McBain admonished him for his obsessive behavior, reminding him that all he had to do was leave her alone. Lawson accused the judge of being buddy-buddy with the victim, once again failing to take responsibility for his actions. McBain sentenced him to 3 days in jail, but Lawson continued to talk back. Each time he mouthed off, McBain increased the sentence until finally it reached 93 days. There was only one court officer in the room, and when he tried to handcuff Lawson and take him into custody, Lawson resisted. A struggle ensued, at which point Judge McBain removed his robe and rushed over. He could be heard instructing the officer to tase his ass right now as he got on the ground to help the officer get Lawson under control. They managed to subdue the defendant without tasing him and hauled him off to jail. Sadly, Lawson didn't learn from the experience. After serving his 93-day sentence for contempt, he went right back to stalking his victim. He was convicted of aggravated stalking and sentenced to 5 years in prison. 12. Melissa Hardwick. Kentucky Family Court Judge Jennifer Edwards was listening to a man explain why he filed a domestic violence complaint against his estranged wife in 2011 when things suddenly spiraled out of control. The estranged wife, Melissa Hardwick, interrupted her husband and was warned by Judge Edwards to stop or she would face a contempt charge. She disobeyed the order and Edwards made good on her promise, sentencing the woman to 10 days in jail. Hardwick reacted to the punishment by lunging at the judge. Footage of the incident showed Hardwick charging over the bench as nearby court deputies yanked her away. She could be heard yelling at the deputies to get off her as they ordered her to put her hands behind her back and handcuffed her. Hardwick continued to yell obscenities and threatened Judge Edwards as she was dragged out of the courtroom. In the moments following the attempted assault, Edwards appeared slightly shaken as she rummaged through court paperwork. She rescued herself from the case and mentioned her plans to have Hardwick criminally charged for her behavior. What started out as a 10-day punishment against Hardwick for contempt ultimately became a 120-day jail sentence. In addition to the contempt charge, she was accused of making terroristic threats, intimidating a judge, and resisting arrest. Hardwick was sentenced to 5 years of probation and ordered to undergo a mandatory mental health evaluation and anger management courses. As a Cleveland Municipal Court judge mentioned in the ID Channel series Chaos in Court, Hardwick was lucky that the bailiffs intervened quickly enough to stop her from reaching the judge, or she would have faced much more serious charges. 11. Donna Koso. During the summer of 2016, Amanda Koso drunkenly crashed head-on into an SUV in Redford Township, Michigan, killing a 31-year-old man and critically injuring his fiancée. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of operating under the influence causing death and was sentenced to 3 to 15 years in prison. A man in the courtroom laughed and smiled the entire time, while a surviving family member of one of the victims delivered an impact statement. Judge Kiana Lillard admonished him for his behavior, calling him a clown, and had him removed from the courtroom. Right after she kicked him out, she had Amanda's mum, Donna Koso, taken away for allegedly laughing and smirking during the hearing. During her disgusted diatribe, the judge addressed Amanda's family directly, stating, "I understand you're all very upset because your loved one is going to prison. But guess what? She's going to prison for the choices that she made." Donna was initially ordered to spend 93 days in jail, but was released the following day after apologizing to Judge Lillard, adding that she'd been under a lot of stress. 10. Jason Clare. One evening in June 2011, Jason Clare made the fateful decision to go to a bar in St. Cloud, Florida, that was offering an unbeatable happy hour price of 4 beers for $1. While there, he got into an altercation over a girl with brothers Joel and James Gunn. Clare would later describe being pinned to the ground and brutally beaten by 3 people outside the bar. At some point during the incident, he managed to get a hold of his gun and open fire, killing the Gunn brothers. During police questioning, Clare insisted that he acted in self-defense and out of fear for his life. He was severely injured and claimed that it was from the Gunn brothers beating him before he shot them. Witnesses gave a much different story, painting Clare out as the aggressor and making it sound like the shooting was completely unprovoked. They said that bystanders beat Gunn out of anger after he shot the victims. Authorities charged Clare with murder, and he continued to maintain his innocence based on Florida's Stand Your Ground law. More than 30 relatives on both sides of the case showed up in court for a pre-trial hearing to determine whether Clare had grounds to argue self-defense. To everyone's disappointment, the judge delayed the position due to new evidence that was presented during the hearing. Tensions were high as these 2 groups of people with starkly opposing views on the case filed out of the courtroom and into a narrow hallway toward the building's exit. So, it wasn't too surprising that all hell broke loose when a friend of the Gunn brothers, Jeremy Million, bumped into Clare. The defendant's stepfather, James Parker, immediately challenged Million to a fight. Punches were thrown as the situation devolved into pure chaos, and Parker was soon entangled in a fistfight with the Gunn brothers' father, James Gunn Sr. Bystanders shrieked as deputies tried to break the 2 men up, but they remained fiercely determined to continue beating each other. Parker relentlessly administered one blow after another against his younger and larger opponent, like a vicious guard dog prepared to take down his enemy at all costs. The fight came to a sudden stop when a court officer threatened to tase the men. Both Parker and Gunn were charged with disorderly conduct and banned from attending any further hearings on the case. The charges against the dueling dads were ultimately dismissed, but Clare was convicted of the Gunn brothers' murders and sentenced to life in prison without parole. 9. Anthony Deese and Jerome Stewart. 59-year-old Dale Williams Sr. of Youngstown, Ohio, was convinced that his girlfriend of 4 years, Elizabeth Pledger Stewart, was cheating on him. She wasn't, but Williams' mind was made up, and there was no convincing him otherwise. He would later tell police that he'd threatened to harm Elizabeth if she didn't stop messing around behind his back. One morning in 2017, Williams decided that she'd gone too far with her alleged infidelity. He ran her car off the road with his van and then shot Elizabeth repeatedly in cold blood. The victim died from her injuries, and Williams was charged with murder. After 2 years of court proceedings, he pleaded guilty to stalking and killing Pledger Stewart. During the first of what would become 2 sentencing hearings, Pledger Stewart's sons, 23-year-old Jerome Stewart and 30-year-old Anthony Deese, charged in Williams. The attack came seemingly out of nowhere, catching the entire courtroom off guard as Deese and Stewart's sister prepared to read a victim impact statement. One of the brothers jumped over a table while the other ran around it. The brothers took Williams to the ground and punched him repeatedly while court officers tried to separate the fight, which ended after one of the men was tased. They were both held in contempt of court and jailed for 30 days on charges of assault and obstructing official business. Williams was taken to the hospital for his injuries and was back in the courtroom a week later for a second sentencing hearing. He was sentenced to 23 years to life in prison. Mahoning County Sheriff Jerry Green told NBC News that he understands how emotions can run high in a courtroom, but that fighting is unacceptable. 8. J. Person Lynn. Prominent California attorney J. Person Lynn had been practicing law for over a decade and had been involved with some high-profile cases when he got into a troubling dispute with the court bailiff in 2019. He had gone on to the San Bernardino courthouse on his day off to deal with routine business that he thought could be handled by the court clerk, but was directed to the courtroom to address the matter. Because Person Lynn didn't expect to go before a judge that day, he was wearing everyday clothing rather than the crisp suit and tie that he normally wore in court. A deputy told him to sit in the gallery area of the courtroom, where non-attorneys usually wait to address their cases. Person Lynn explained that he was an attorney, and the deputy instructed him to speak with the bailiff. Instead of listening to what Person Lynn was trying to say, the bailiff told him to stay out of the part of the courtroom that was reserved exclusively for attorneys. Once again, he explained that he was an attorney and that he was there to discuss a case. He reached into his back pocket to grab his wallet and show the staff members his bar ID, but before he could do that, an officer pushed him out of the attorney-only area. Courtroom footage appears to show the officer putting his hand on Person Lynn's chest. The attorney would later tell the ID series Chaos in Court that it was the first time anyone had ever shoved or grabbed him in a courtroom. He continued trying to explain to the deputies why he was in court, but was told to leave. Court officers were seen escorting Person Lynn out of the courtroom and out of the camera's view. In an audio recording of the conversation, Person Lynn could be heard giving a deputy the number of the case he was trying to deal with. By then, he was understandably frustrated, and he minced no words while telling the staff that they screwed up and that he planned to legally come after them for the way they treated him. Just moments later, one of the deputies tased him. Person Lynn was charged with obstructing an officer in the performance of his duty. He was sentenced to a year of probation. The deputy who tackled him was not charged for excessive force, but some believe that he should have been. A judge accused Person Lynn of escalating the situation, but he was left feeling suspicious that he was treated differently because of his race. 7. Taylor's Shah Business. In early 2022, a mother came home to find her son, 25-year-old Shad Therian, dismembered and scattered throughout the basement of their Green Bay, Wisconsin home. Police identified the last person Shad was with as 24-year-old Taylor Shah Business and tracked her down. They found more of Shad's body parts in her van. Shah Business reportedly admitted to using methamphetamine with the victim before the murder. She claimed that she snapped and blacked out and couldn't remember what happened during the violent episode. Authorities charged her with first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, and assault. Given the horrific nature of the crime and the young woman's behavior, her mental health has landed at the center of her court proceedings. During a competency hearing in early 2023, Shah Business's court-appointed attorney, Quinn Jolly, asked the judge to reschedule the session so the defense could have extra time to review the case. Something about Jolly's request apparently sent Shah Business into a rage. She charged at her lawyer and elbowed him in the head. A nearby court deputy wrestled her to the ground, and she was removed from the courtroom. Despite her erratic behavior, the judge found Sharp Business competent to stand trial and granted Jolly's request to withdraw from the case. 6. Wesley Thomas. 19-year-old Michael Roark was a U.S. Army soldier stationed at Fort Stewart in Georgia when he joined an anti-government militia of disgruntled soldiers who called themselves Forever Enduring and Always Ready, or FEAR. Formed in 2011, the extremist group had some extremely heinous crimes on its agenda, including assassinating then-President Barack Obama, blowing up major dams, launching deadly chemical attacks, infiltrating the drug trade, and doing other things to take down the federal government. At some point, Roark began dating a young woman named Tiffany York, and his involvement in FEAR lessened as he focused on his new relationship. He also made plans to leave the military, causing the group to worry that he would rat them out to authorities. To prevent that from happening, 4 FEAR members lured Michael and Tiffany into the woods by inviting them on a hunting trip. After getting the couple into a remote area, the renegade soldiers ambushed them with gunfire, fatally shooting them both. Christopher Salmon, Anthony Peden, Isaac Agwigwi, and Michael Burnett were charged with murder. During a pre-trial hearing for Anthony Peden, who was accused of firing the shots that killed Tiffany, the young woman's stepfather Wesley Thomas lost control of his emotions and lunged at the defendant. It took 4 court officers to take him to the ground and handcuff him. In the meantime, Roark's father shouted out in Thomas's defense, reminding the court that he was a father who just lost a child. When the officers lifted Thomas to his feet, one of them patted him on the chest as if to let him know that he understood why Thomas was upset, but he had to do his job and maintain order in the court. Peden, Christopher Salmon, and Isaac Agwigwi were all sentenced to life in prison for murder, while Burnett received an 8-year sentence for reduced charges in exchange for his cooperation against the other 3. Courtroom chaos broke out again during Christopher Salmon's sentencing hearing, when he tried to say he was sorry for his actions. Unwilling to entertain the apology, a member of Roark's family yelled at him to shut up, but he obeyed the judge's command for order in the court, and that was the end of his outburst. 5. Robert Fleck. During a DUI hearing in Jefferson County, Kentucky in 2014, Assistant District Attorney Robert Fleck got into an argument with the defendant's lawyer. Just months earlier, he had been suspended for 30 days for threatening a public defender. Upon returning to work, he'd signed a zero-tolerance agreement promising to keep his behavior under control. Clearly, that didn't last. The DUI hearing spun out of control as Fleck belittled the defense attorney, calling him "buddy boy" and shouting over him as he tried to argue his case to the court. Fleck repeatedly ignored the judge's orders to maintain his composure as he devolved into a diatribe about how disrespected and insulted he felt by his rookie opponent. Frustrated with the unprofessional behavior, the judge called a recess and ordered for the hearing to resume later that day. That was unacceptable to Fleck, who had lunch plans with his mother. As the courtroom cleared out, he stood at the microphone and droned incredulously about how the recess was causing him to stand up his 83-year-old mother. The judge refused to entertain the argument and reiterated the court would resume that afternoon at 1:00 p.m. Fleck said that, "For the record, I think this is BS," and stormed out of the courtroom. After having a little while to cool down, he apologized to the court for his outburst, explaining that he couldn't bear the thought of his mother showing up for lunch and him not being there as promised. But he continued to blame the defense attorney for his behavior, so the judge cut him off and told him to either apologize or don't apologize. He apologized and was probably lucky that the judge didn't hold him in contempt. After hearing about the incident, Fleck's bosses decided that enough was enough and fired him. He now practices on the other side of the aisle as a criminal defense attorney. 4. Donald Byrd. While working as a strip club security guard in Miami in 2012, Lukachi Kendall approached 2 unarmed African-American men who were sitting in a vehicle and opened fire on them, killing Kijwan Byrd and leaving Michael Smathers paralyzed from the waist down. Kendall argued in court that he shot the victims in self-defense based on Florida's Stand Your Ground law. But even in a state that gives gun owners unusually wide parameters for pulling the trigger in the name of self-defense, Kendall's claims seemed outrageous. Not only did the evidence show that the victims desperately tried to take cover while Kendall relentlessly sprayed them with bullets, he had a criminal record and a troubling history of mentally unstable behavior. He'd been kicked out of the Navy and certainly had no business working as an armed security guard. Throughout his court proceedings, Kendall was examined by multiple mental health experts who concluded that he was competent to stand trial. When his pre-trial hearing finally rolled around in 2014, 2 years after the murder, several of the victims' relatives were there, including Kijuan Byrd's father, Donald. During the hearing, Kendall's defense attorney argued that his client should be kept under observation at a local mental hospital. Outraged by the mere suggestion, Donald Byrd began yelling about how Kendall belonged in prison. He accused the defendant of playing crazy and rose from his seat while family members and a court officer tried to calm him down. The anguish in Donald's voice was heart-wrenching, and his heightened emotion was understandable, considering the fact that he lost a son to senseless violence and that Kendall reacted to his outburst by smirking. But a courtroom demands order, and the grieving father had to be removed when he didn't stop yelling. Thankfully, Donald ultimately got his wish. Kendall was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. 3. Jeremy Shue. After suffering from a number of strokes, 39-year-old Jeremy Shue was left with limited use of his legs and arms. In early 2020, he was rolled into an Ann Arbor, Michigan courtroom in a wheelchair to face a slew of felony charges for a series of home and vehicle break-ins, as well as a drug possession charge. During the hearing, Shue's attorney filed a motion to recuse the judge, David Schwartz, because he felt as though the judge had treated his client unfairly in the past. This type of request is typically granted in cases where a defense attorney can successfully argue that a judge has a bias against the defendant. But Shue's attorney failed to convince the court that his client would get a fairer shake under another judge, and the motion was denied. In response, the defense attorney asked to be withdrawn from the case, most likely so Shue couldn't accuse him of ineffective counsel, and for another lawyer to be assigned to help his client. Schwartz denied the attorney's request, at which point Shue asked to represent himself. In response, the judge told Shue that he thinks representing himself was a foolish idea. Shue said, "That's your opinion," and the judge responded, "That's fine, you don't have to buy my opinion." By then, it was obvious based on Shue's escalating tone that he was becoming increasingly frustrated. He continued to challenge Schwartz, who remained impressively calm and gave Shue permission to represent himself. The judge set a trial date, and Shue instantly became angry because he didn't think it gave him enough time to prepare his case. Schwartz basically told him that he had no say in the matter and reiterated the planned trial date. Despite being in a severely weakened physical state due to his health problems, Shue was so overcome with rage that he managed to muster enough strength to flip over the defense table. Court officers pushed him back down into his wheelchair and removed him from the courtroom. To add to his growing list of legal problems, Shue was held in contempt of court on a $50,000 bond. 2. Peter Hafer. 30-year-old Peter Hafer was accused of stealing $51,000 worth of jewelry from a big box store in Scott County, Kentucky in 2008. In a scene that sounds like it came straight out of an action movie, he allegedly broke into the store through its HVAC system in the middle of the night and slid down a rope onto the sales floor. He was charged with third-degree burglary and criminal mischief and faced up to 5 years in prison if convicted. During a court hearing, Hafer asked the judge to replace his court-appointed attorney, Doug Crickmer. He accused Crickmer of failing to provide adequate representation, while Crickmer told the judge that Hafer expected things that the court wasn't willing to provide, including a lesser sentence than what had been offered to him as part of a plea deal. The attorney later told the ID Channel series Chaos in Court that it tried to negotiate in Hafer's favor, but the prosecution was unwilling to budge, and Hafer blamed him for it. Much to Hafer's dismay, the judge denied his request. It's clear based on courtroom footage that the defendant was about to boil over with anger. After brewing for a few moments, as if to contemplate his next move, Hafer punched Crickmer in the face full force and knocked him to the ground. He continued to beat the attorney, while most of the court staff stood around dumbfounded. There was only one officer in the courtroom at the time, so the judge hit the panic button. By the time deputies flooded into the room and apprehended Hafer, Crickmer was seriously injured. He told Chaos in Court that he had no memory of what happened between the moment he noticed Hafer's fist heading toward his face and when he woke up in the hospital. Crickmer opted not to press charges against Hafer, but he was done acting as his attorney. In the end, the situation worked out for Hafer, who finally got his wish and received a new lawyer. But the judge was less forgiving than Crickmer over the assault and sentenced the defendant to 6 months in jail for contempt of court. 1. Marco Perea. Just days before Christmas in 2014, police officer Charles Condek was shot dead while responding to a noise complaint at an apartment building in Tarpon Springs, Florida. The killer, Marco Perea, had been released from prison just 9 months earlier for other crimes and was on parole at the time of the shooting. The complaint that Condek was responding to had nothing to do with Perea, and the officer was sadly just in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the suspect fled the scene in a stolen car, he ran over the dying cop. Perea had a lengthy criminal history, so people understandably found it hard to believe he was being sincere when he expressed remorse for his actions. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, and the case went to a jury to decide whether he would receive the death penalty or spend the rest of his life in prison. At the beginning of his sentencing hearing, Perea apologized to Condek's family and begged the jury to spare his life. After deliberating for 5 hours, the jury came back with their decision and handed their paperwork to the judge, who looked it over and announced that Perea would be sentenced to death. Relieved sighs could be heard throughout the courtroom, but when the judge checked the sheet showing the jurors' individual verdicts, he noticed that 2 of them had voted against the death penalty. In Florida, a jury must be unanimously in support for the death penalty in order for it to be imposed. The jury foreman had checked the wrong box on the paperwork. After catching the mistake, the judge announced that Perea would spend life in prison, generating happy reactions from his family and utter dismay from pretty much everyone else in the courtroom. Condek's loved ones sobbed loudly as they broke down from what felt like the cruelest blow of injustice yet. Unfortunately, nothing could be done to change the outcome of the case, leaving them with no other choice than to find ways to cope with the decision and carry on with their lives. Thanks for watching. Would you be willing to overlook someone's criminal lifestyle and be their friend if they seem like a good person at heart and you enjoyed their company? Or would you keep your distance no matter how likable the person is? Let us know in the comments below and remember to subscribe. See you soon. Bye.